How you going, guys, and welcome back to another video all about the preparation on your HS primer or high solid primers. Now I'll be painting some candy in this video, so if you want to stay to the end you'll actually see this dragonfly green candy getting put over a blue metallic. It's a fantastic colour. I've painted the combination before. It looks rad. Now I've got a few topics on my phone which I want to cover in this video. Now we're going to be talking about a few different topics. The first one is the importance of a guide coat, also the preferred grits of sandpaper which you should use to sand your primer, the finishing grits which you should use to finish your primer prep, and also what is shrink back and how to avoid it. Alright, so let's talk about the first topic, and that is a guide coat and why it's important to use one. So here we've got a paint guide coat. So you can see here we've put a dust coat of black base coat over the top of the primer. I haven't started sanding this yet. So what the guide coat is doing is basically it's going over the top, so when you sand it you can see what's been sanded and what hasn't, just as a quick little skim over. I'll go into more depth about it in just a minute. Now there's two typical guide coats which are available and they all serve a really good purpose. You've got a paint guide coat and you've also got a charcoal guide coat. Now they are completely different, and in my opinion they should be used at certain times during the prep process. Now as an example, you've just HS primed your part. What guide coat do you use? A charcoal guide coat or do you use a paint guide coat? Now I've done both on many different primers over the years, and I find that using a paint guide coat over the top of a non-sanded primer is really good. By using a charcoal guide coat over a non-sanded primer, what that will do is pretty much just sit on the top. It has no scratches to sit in and really highlight. So when you sand it, you're not really seeing exactly what's going on the panel. By using a paint guide coat, it sticks to the surface, so when you sand it, it sands off and you can see all the imperfections. Now, that's pretty much when you should use a paint over a charcoal. Now, let's say that you have used the paint guide coat and you've sanded it all off. Then before you jump to your next lower grit of sandpaper, by using a charcoal guide coat, the charcoal is really fine particles which will sit in all your sanding scratches, really highlighting them when you go and sand with a lower grit. Now, or a high grit, like a 400. Now, I better pull my phone out again and see what the next topic was. Okay, so preferred grits of sanding your primer. Now there's heaps of different grits out there. Which ones do you choose? Now, back in the day when I was an apprentice, we used to always sand our primer with 180 grit. I've since changed my method slightly over the years, going a little bit finer, but still coarse enough to get rid of the orange peel in a timely fashion. And by that, I mean I've actually gone from 180 down to 240. That change happened probably 10 years ago, maybe longer. Now, by using a 240, it's going to do several things. It's going to sand that guide coat, that painted guide coat off. It's coarse enough to block out any imperfections, so ripples in your panels, chips and scratches, not that you should be priming over them anyway, but little imperfections on the panel, etc. Now, it's a really good idea to use 240. You can use a finer grit like 320 if you want, but you will find that your sandpaper will clog up a lot faster and you'll waste more sandpaper by using 320 over 240. Now, what grits of sandpaper should you finish your primer in before paint? Now, there's two main grits. Depending on what you're doing, depending on the shape of the panel, how many body lines there are, is there any body lines, the edges of the panel. These three things have their different grits of sandpaper. Now, as an example, I've sanded down, I've block sanded with 240 grit. I've then used a charcoal guide coat over the top. All our charcoal particles are sat in all the scratches. I'll then jump to a orbital sander using a interface pad, which is a foam little pad which you put on top of the hard surface of the orbital sander. which will effectively reduce the amount of vibration through the panel. The vibrations can cause ripples in your panel, so it's incredibly important that you do use an interface pad. Now the grit that I use on that interface pad is 400 grit. Now depending on if you're painting DG, so like direct gloss, what direct gloss is a color mixed with a hardener and reducer. When it dries, it stays glossy. COB is clear over base, so it will always be like glossy, depending if you put it on nice enough. But it has better UV resistance. It will give your colors a little bit more depth of color. There's quite a few different positives in that over painting in DG. I won't get into everything in this video. So a preferred grit of sandpaper that you should be finishing your primed area is, if you're painting in DG, you can finish in 320 grit. If you're painting COB, then I recommend finishing in 400. Now 400 should be used over the whole part, and what you're actually looking for is, while you're sanding, is removing those 240 grit scratches left in all those scratches which the guide coat is set in. So you're effectively continuously sanding until you're removing all those scratches in, so you're removing all the charcoal guide coat set in those 240 scratches. Now let's say that you've got some body lines, you've got lots of edges on panels. If you're painting a door, you've got the square edge around the door. What grit should you use? Now if you use 400 grit along the edges and also over the body lines, you're more than likely to sand through that primer, creating more issues later, which will require some form of primer over the top to seal down the rub throughs. Now I'll touch base a little bit in a minute about rub throughs and shrinkage, what it is and how to prevent it. So I'm kind of touching base on the preventatives of rub throughs right now. So by sanding with 800 grit wet over all your body lines and over your edges is really suitable. Now this is mainly for sanding a primer. If you're sanding a pre-existing painted surface, then grey Scotch-Brite and paste over your edges and over your body lines will prevent any rub throughs. So 400 grit, just so we're all on the same page here, you want to block sand with 240. You want to reed guide coat with the charcoal so the charcoal sits in those scratches. And then you want to finish in 400 on an orbital sander using an interface pad, and then edges, body lines, sand 800 grit wet. Now that is the dry sanding method. Now there are wet sanding methods. You can block sand with 400 or 500 wet. It can be incredibly messy. You need to have like a rag that's soaked in water that you can squeege, so you can rinse out that rag so water's dripping over the panel that you're sanding or the area that you're sanding. It's incredibly messy. It's not the way that I do things. Some people say that you can get a flatter finish if you finish in wet sanding. I'm still yet to see a job that you can really see the difference. I think if you put your clear coat on wet at the end, it doesn't matter how flat that surface was, you're still going to be getting a flat finish. So there's a lot of he said, she said. It's all down to what you're used to, what works, and that's what I'm teaching in this video. Alright, so we've covered that. So my preferred method of sanding is always dry. It is always good to use a dustless sander like a vacuum or use a respirator or both. Now, the next topic of this video is what is shrink back. Now shrink back is basically, it can be caused by several different things. I'll just touch base on two of them in this video. Now what shrink back is, let's say as an example that you've done a filler repair, you've primed it, you've sanded that panel and you've cut through that primer showing the body filler. Now you can use a etch primer over that area. If it's small enough, like a stone chip size, it's more suitable. But if you've got a rub through the size of like a 50-cent coin or a shape or size this big, I highly recommend re-priming that area again. Now if you don't re-prime it, what will happen is when you paint your base coat and like your clear, over time, the filler will actually, being porous, it will suck in all the paintwork and shrink it in. And what you'll actually see is a slight ripple there. You'll also see a more orange peel finish, and you'll see a ring. I think I said that. You can see a ring. Now, it's incredibly visible if that happens. You can spot it straight away. So by re-priming any rub-throughs that you've got on your panels is a really good idea. But as I did say, if you've noticed that there's a stone chip in your primer which didn't get filled or get sanded out, you can use a bit of fine fill, not bog, fine fill, and razor blade that in, wet sand it down so it's got a small little dome. By the time you've painted it, it'll be flat, you won't see it. Now, that has so for a stone chip, you can use like an etch primer in aerosol, or a epoxy in aerosol is also really good. But 9 times out of 10, if you're painting in an accident repair shop, you will be using a wet on wet sealer, a sealer primer. I did have a question about that in a previous video. I'll make another video about high build primers and sealers, surfaces. I'll make that video later. Now, so that's one form of shrink back. Now, there's another form of shrink back which is incredibly important, and it kind of touches base on what I spoke about with your sanding grits. Choosing the right grits for sanding, finishing in the correct grit will also prevent shrink back. So let's say that you block sanded with 180 grit or 240, you didn't guide coat it, you've gone over it with 400 or 320 on an orbital sander, you've sanded down all the panel, you think that you've removed all the scratches, and you go and paint over the top. Let's say that you've painted a silver metallic, just as an example. What that is actually doing, the metallic particles will land on the primer, will sit in those scratches. If you don't see it, which is pretty easy to see, it's pretty visible if that happens. But if you don't see it, if you're a lazy painter, or maybe there was a bit down the bottom on a seal panel that you didn't see, didn't get down there to have a good look, what that will do, the paint particles will sit in those scratches. When you go and put your clear coat on, when all the paint fully cures, the paint will shrink a little bit, but it will sit in those scratches, and you'll be able to see a scratch underneath your clear coat. And depending on the light source which is on the panel, it will really highlight itself and make your paint job look horrible. So that's another form of shrink back. So just touching base on the correct grits, by choosing the correct grits and by using a charcoal guide coat which will sit in all those scratches, if you're going over the panel properly, looking for those scratches while you're sanding, you will prevent any shrink back later happening in your paint job. So I've pretty much covered a lot of information there. If you're a little bit unsure or have a question about something that I've mentioned in this video, jump down in those comments, guys. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. I'm no fancy chip foos expert, but I have been doing a long time. My quality work is up there, and I always strive to better myself and make your guys' paint work even get better as well. So that's what this channel is about. Now, with that said, guys, we're going to be, if I haven't already put the footage up on the screen, we've already sanded down these parts, maybe, in the future. They're still here. So we're going to sand these down now, I think the way that I'll edit this video is I've already sanded them. Let's go jump in the booth and start laying down our black base coat as the ground coat for the Avatar Blue. That's what I've done on the motorbike tank itself. So it's a really good idea to replicate what I've done on the tank so the whole bike matches. Yeah, we're going to lay down the black, lay down the blue, lay down, I think 5 coats from memory. I usually write it down. 5 coats of candy of the Dragonfly Green candy over the top of the blue. I'll be using the Diamond Clear 2:1, 10% of reducer. Let's go.